Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take another look at our P7 practice. And specifically, we are going to take a look at some of the little helper functions that will help in building a more sophisticated application. And this video assumes a number of things that you have already watched, sort of the introductory video for this series. This is meant to be a long and rambling set of videos that focus on various features and how we can build these features into bigger and bigger applications. And again, this particular video may not necessarily perfectly match what you're trying to do, but the concepts can be applied then to other projects. So to begin with, let's take a look at one of our little helper functions, and that is our get product parametrically. The idea is that we have, for instance, an inventory for a kiosk or a small business, and we have read it into memory. And now the idea is that we also want to add a new product to our inventory or to our array. But the question becomes, where do we get the information for this new product? Now, in an earlier video, we focused on how to do that interactively. And in earlier series, you have also done that interactively. In other words, a combination of printfs and scanfs. Well, in this particular video, we want to focus on a function that does the same thing, except it gets the information from the command line. In other words, it allows for you to automate that process. And what we're going to do is we're going to encapsulate that process into a function so that we do not continue to muddy up our main. In other words, that we don't have a bunch of code in our main, but rather the logic or the controlling behavior of your function sits in main. And then we have these helper functions that do the work for us. So let's go ahead and get started by taking a look at this function. You'll notice that it has roughly the same function signature as our main. In other words, you'll notice here, if we scroll down here, we have our argv, and it is a char double pointer. The idea is that it is going to be an array of strings or an array of character vectors, or rather an array of character vectors, if you want to think of it like that. And I have changed this up a little bit just for consistency's sake with our other functions, but we also have an n. And effectively what that n does is it tells us how big this array is. And then we also have our product property structure as a address of a structure. And what this means is that I can update the destination product property structure inside of our get product parametrically. Translation, I can loop through our arguments, depending on how many there are, and I can simply use those arguments to plug in the fields in our destination structure. Now, first thing that we want to do is we simply want to copy and paste our function prototype, turn it into a function stub. And then let's take a second to go ahead and add a little bit of documentation here. We'll start off with our name of our function. Again, we're simply going to borrow the name of the function here to keep this simple. We have our description, and this will allow for us to parametrically collect the fields of a product structure. The idea is that this is going to be for automation purposes. Got parametrically spelled wrong, not a big deal there. And then the last thing that we want then is going to be our arguments. And the arguments are going to be the constant char double pointer argv. And this is the command line arguments or custom arguments. In other words, we are not limited to only getting the arguments from the command line, but rather another portion of our code or another part of our application could pass to us a unstructured, if you would, or poorly structured array of strings that we then can parse into our fields. Now, the other one is simply going to be our int n, that is going to be the length of argv. And then we have our product properties destination, which is going to be a by address. And a better way of looking at this is going to be updatable product structure. Last thing will be our return value, which will be an int, and this returns success or failure. Now, we're not going to be looking too much at validation in this particular video. As a matter of fact, we're going to come back to this helper function more than once because we can discuss about what we want our argument array to look like. For right now, what we're going to do is we're going to keep it pretty simple, and that we're going to assume that the arguments are simply going to correspond to the arguments on the command line. And to help us understand a little bit about this, we're going to go up to our structure, and we're simply going to borrow the fields in our structure. And we're going to go ahead and use them as local variables, but more importantly, they are also going to determine the order in which the arguments are passed. And so if you think about it as coming from the command line, we want to pass the ID, the name, the type, the description, the price, and the quantity. Now, this is going to present us with a number of problems, not the least of which is getting the argument count correct. Now, in our initial use of argv and argc in main, we had to keep track of the executable as well as any additional switches that might be passed to indicate the control of our application. Well, to understand what I'm referring to, let's take a look real quick at our help as a reminder for how the existing features already work in our application. The idea here is that we already have our help and our search, and what we'd like to do is we'd like to add the ability to get this information from the command line parametrically. And one example of that would be that we would like to simply add or get the information from the command line. So let's think about then what switches will in fact be needed for this particular feature. Well, we'll start off with the idea of being able to add. And so we'll start off here with P7 practice.exe, and that we simply want to add a product. And from there, we will specify the ID, the name, the type, the description, the price, and the quantity. And then again, we will simply just put a little placeholder here that you will need to update then later on, indicating what we're calling. But more importantly, what we want to do now is we want to focus on that argument count. And to understand what that is, we simply need to count up then the number of arguments, including the executable. So this is going to be our 0th argument, argument index 1, argument index 2, 3, and then so on. So a total is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we have to keep track then of the argument count as 8. Now, as I said, we're going to come back to this particular function. We may end up renaming it because this is going to severely limit the argv that can be passed. For right now, we're going to assume that it's coming directly from the command line, but it may not be. In other words, it may be coming from other portions in our application. And more importantly, it does not then allow for us to reuse this function other than for the purposes of adding. But again, we're going to keep this particular example simple, and instead we're going to focus on the scenario where argc is equal to 8, which is again going to be the same as n equal to 8. So the first thing that we want to do is we simply want to check to make sure that our argc was in fact equal to 8. And then for the purposes right now, we also want to check to see that the argv square brackets 2 matches the add. And so in this case, string compare I matches the slash add. I think you can immediately see where this is going to severely limit the use of this function. And again, we're going to come back to this. But for right now, we're going to focus just on building this helper function. Out of habit, I wrote argc is equal to 8, but instead it's going to be n equals to 8. And then if this is not the case, then basically what we need to do is possibly make a call to help. Again, we can decide if that's the best approach, but if nothing else, what we want to do now is we want to leverage a return value. And so we're going to have our int results. We're going to initialize our int results to exit success. And more importantly, we have our results equal to exit failure. And then lastly, we want to make sure to return our results. Now, under the true branch of this if statement, what we want to do is we simply want to pick apart the argv variable. In other words, the array of character vectors or array of strings that has been passed. And we want to start off assuming that the array of useful information starts with argv square brackets 3, and then simply continues on to argv square brackets 7. Now, again, hopefully we don't have any mistakes here in our counting. The 0th one is going to be the name of the executable. Actually, I do, because the way I've done this, my add is actually going to be argv square brackets 1. So we start off the useful information with argv square brackets 2. And we continue up to argv square brackets 7. And again, we're going to look at this multiple different ways. For right now, what I'm doing is I'm transitioning us from thinking of this in our main into a little helper function. And so what we can do then is we can simply just plug into our destination structure the values in the assumed location of our argv array. And we've got a couple of ways that we can go about doing this. The first thing that we can do is we can simply copy the argv values from the structure into our local variables, or we can leverage them directly into the destination structure. And so if we start off with our destination structure and we use the dot notation, we want to copy to the ID using our string copy function. Again, we can't directly assign the value, simply the contents of argv square brackets 2. And again, what we will do here is using our string copy and our destination structure, we want to copy over the name. And again, you'll notice here that if we do try to use the destination dot notation for the fields, then because we are passing this structure by reference or by address, then we have to use the dash greater than sign, or essentially the pointer notation, because we're passing it by address to a given field. And in this case, then we're going to focus on our type, argv square brackets 4. And the last character string is going to be the description. And we have our argv square brackets 5. And then for our numeric fields, we can drop the string copy, but we are then presented with another problem in that for the price, we can't just simply say price equal to argv square bracket 6. As a matter of fact, why don't we forget what we need to do and let's just build it to see what kind of error we get. And fundamentally, what we're trying to do is we're trying to take a character, vector, or array, and we are trying to assign it to a numeric field, which again won't work, which means that we need to bring in some helper functions, our a to f. And for the quantity, we will do the same thing here. A to f, rather, a little mistype there, and then a to I for our argv square brackets 7. Now, for those of you that are familiar with C and watching along, you know that I've got all sorts of problems here, both procedurally for C as well as just in general as far as validating my fields of data. And we're going to handle this in later videos, but I just want to highlight the problems here. Number one is I'm not checking any of the lengths of my arguments, and I have fixed fields associated with my structure, which means that I could accidentally pass to the destination ID a field that is much longer than it should be. Same with the name, type, and description. In my price and quantity fields, I also have problems because I'm not guaranteed with the a to f or a to I function that I will get the numeric value that was intended to be passed on the console. So in other words, we desperately need to validate these fields before we just start putting them into our destination structure. However, we are going to handle that in later videos. If anything, I just want to focus on the bare essentials in this particular video, and that is to focus on how to update this structure by reference or by address inside of a function utilizing the arguments from the command line. And again, kind of do this in a little bit of a helper function that we are going to grow and evolve in later videos. The other thing you'll notice here is that because I decided to plug directly into the structure, which is again, not necessarily a good approach, I technically don't need all of these local variables, but I will use them in later iterations of this function. And so for right now, we're going to leave them in. I'm going to take a second just to go ahead and build our application. And again, a little thing to note here is the warnings in that, again, what I mentioned, our argv may be much larger, argv square brackets 2 in this particular case, may be much larger than the field associated with the destination. Now, we're not going to troubleshoot or even attempt to run this particular function in this video. If anything, we're going to focus on how we can put the pieces together and troubleshoot then in later videos. But hopefully you found this video useful. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.